Thank you, guys. All right, so let's kick this off. Okay, I'm going to tell you guys a story. It's a story about a moment where I was struggling. I was heavily breathing. I was exhausted. And at that moment, I bent over my ice axes, my head drooped towards the snow, and this feeling flooded through me, a feeling I was really unfamiliar with in the mountains. I was angry. Throw those to the side. At that moment, I was 4,000 feet below the summit of the highest mountain in North America. I had just ascended the fixed lines on the West Buttress route of Denali. Well, I, along with 4 of my other teammates, had actually decided to skip the fixed lines. We opted to forego the safety of ascending on ropes just so that we could pass the slew of average Joe climbers that we thought were climbing a little bit too slow. And you see, our plan was to go from 14,000 feet to the summit, 20,000 feet, 300, in one day. We were skipping the average, what most Denali summiters do, which is to take 1 day of rest at 17,500 feet. So we had to move fast. But as we got to the ridgeline on 16,000 feet, I realized our pace was a little bit too fast, or at least I thought it was too fast. I didn't think it was a pace we could sustain to the summit. And that's when I got angry. That's when I actually got angry and a little bit scared too. Because at that moment, I realized that my heavy breathing, my highly elevated heart rate, I realized that it could catch up to me as I got higher up the mountain. I realized a mistake at 16,000 feet could spell disaster at 20,000 feet, just as it had for a fellow climber who only 8 days earlier had succumbed to a fatal bout of high-altitude pulmonary edema near where we were. So I could understand the fear. But at that moment, I couldn't quite understand the anger. I didn't know why it was boiling up inside me. You know, about 3 hours before, I was with my teammates, and we were laughing, joking. We'd enjoyed every single moment of the way up that mountain. A couple hours later, I kind of wanted to scream at them. I was angry. In that moment, I also realized I needed to make a plan. I had to figure out what was going on at that moment. And I knew at that moment my decision that I make could be the difference between life and death, or success and failure, or maybe even just like a happy moment, or maybe a lifetime of regret. So let me back the story up a little bit more too. So this is more about the story of what I learned that day on Denali. And that secret, there's a secret I want to tell you, that professional athletes have pretty big egos. Yeah, it's not much of a secret because most people kind of equate professional athletes with having superstar level egos. But the thing is, I guarantee if you ever meet professional athletes, especially the ones in the outdoor industry, the ones that I know, the ones I go into the mountains with, most people walk away and say things like, oh, that person is so humble, or they're so down to earth. And they truly are. But back to that secret. They do have an ego. They wouldn't accomplish the things they've accomplished, have this fundamental belief in oneself to do the impossible without having this ego. But again, they are humble. So how can that be? How can these professional athletes who do things like climb the highest mountains on earth, ski the gnarliest lines in the world, and do things that people generally think are impossible, yet still remain humble? This was a question I asked myself quite often. I asked myself quite often through life. Without knowing the answer, in the process of trying to learn it, I've nearly killed myself. There's been points where I've wrestled with this, like how do you get through this with having this confidence, but the humility to stay alive? What is the key to being able to do these things, but being able to turn around? And this was a question I knew that was key on that day on Denali. So Herman Boole, he was a climber. He had this quote that says, the mountains have a way of dealing with overconfidence. They usually have a way of dealing with an overabundance of ego. Usually, the mountains deal with it in a very cruel and careless way. Usually, they deal with it in a way that Herman Boole perished while he was climbing Chogalisa, a 25,000-foot peak in Pakistan, just a few weeks after his first ascent of Broad Peak in Pakistan, and this was back in the 1950s. So, there has to be this balance, right? This balance between confidence and humility. This balance between believing you can do the impossible, but staying alive in dangerous terrain. This balance between this ego that drives you up, but the humility to turn back down. So back to Denali. So in that moment, sitting there, seething at my teammates, I looked around, and I looked at two guys in particular, two guys that were setting the pace. And I realized one of the guys had climbed all of the 7 summits, the highest summits in the world, before his 17th birthday. He also happens to he has a physique that looks as if Superman decided to get into CrossFit. The other guy, he had been camping above 14,000 feet at Denali for over a month, so he was hyper acclimatized. And I was angry at these two guys because I wanted something out of them. And what I wanted out of them was for them to slow down so that I could keep up. I wanted to pass those average Joes with ease. I wanted to be able to summit Denali and feel like these superhumans in front of me. And that's when I took stock of what my goal was. My goal was to summit and ski Denali. My ego wanted something entirely different. And that's when this hyper-rational voice stuck up in my head. All of a sudden, I started taking analysis of the situation. I realized we had perfect weather. We had nearly unlimited time because the sun doesn't really set in Alaska at that time of year because this was in the summer, and that there was actually no danger to myself or my teammates if I were to climb by myself. I also took stock of who I was at that moment, who I was as an individual, what my physical capabilities of, what my physical limitations were, what my mental state was, and at that moment, what my emotional state was. And I realized I had to navigate that person through this mountain that can often be cruel and careless. But I had to make that one key decision, and that key decision was to kick my ego to the curb. So I dropped off the back like a Tour de France rider on a beach cruiser. I watched those two guys just walk off into the distance, turn into little dots, and I shed my desire to try and keep up with these guys. And then suddenly, I was happy. I was breathing well. I was stoked. I was back to that person I know that I am in the mountains, just happy to be there, taking in the view, just taking in the awe of this place. Many hours later, and a lot of suffering, ended up catching back up with those guys. We ended up getting to the top of Denali together. At that moment, I was probably the most stoked I've ever been. I took in this view that was one of the most beautiful views I've ever seen, and I realized I had just pushed myself harder physically than I ever had. I realized I just had this emotional breakthrough, this mental breakthrough, and as I sat there taking it all in, I might have cried a little bit. That is, I definitely cried, actually. That was the third time I cried. High altitude does weird things to your brain, I'll tell you that. An hour later, I was skiing chalky powder snow down the Mesner Couloir. The sun was starting to reach towards the horizon. It was 10 at night. I ended up skiing it by myself, and it was one of the best runs of my life. And we got down to camp, and everything was complete. My goal was done. As we got back to dry land, I kind of had a realization. The realization was that I didn't go just to climb and ski Denali. I realized this was part of a test. This was a test for myself for this dream that started to pop up into my head. This was my first test to see if I mentally, physically, and emotionally could do this project that I call the 50. And what is a 50? The 50 is this project and goal I set myself out on. And I started this last year. And what it is my goal is to climb and ski all 50 of the lines chronicled in this book called the 50 Classic Ski Descents of North America. It's a really audacious goal. No one's ever done it before. And right now, I started off last year, I'm 20 lines in, making a YouTube series along the way, and we're having a lot of success. But I realize there's also a long way to go. And I realized this project that popped up in my head came from the same audacity to think that I could climb and ski Denali, even though that was my very first time above 14,000 feet. It was my very first multi-night ski expedition. And I realized that this was something that I might be able to do. But the lesson I came away with wasn't not just that I might be able to do the 50, but that I had to have a relationship with that audacity, that confidence. I had to find a balance between this belief that I could do the 50, that I could climb Denali, and the humility to turn around. It was the key thing I needed to learn to do something as hard as the 50, but stay alive during the whole process. You know, like quite often, I get a lot of questions, and professional athletes get a lot of questions. We talk about fear. We talk about management of fear. And I'm finding the relationship with ego to be just as important. You know, professional athletes, we have to go out there and manage our fear, and we also have to manage our ego. And just like fear, ego isn't inherently negative. It's something that you have to work with in the mountains. It's something you have to understand. You have to understand its nuances, its desires, and work with it. You have to understand that it's simply an emotion, and you have to navigate yourself and those emotions through the mountains. And that was the lesson I learned on Denali that day. And that is a story about a little moment. So, and also if no one knows about the 50, if you want to watch it, it's on YouTube. It's up there. You can follow me along this journey. Did the first year this year. Got a lot more to go. So thank you guys.
Good job.